She wasn't crying. She didn't have the strength. They dragged her up to the stage, blood soaking through her dress, a newborn in her arms, and silence where her voice should have been. No family, no name spoken, just a girl, sold beside her child like a package deal no one wanted to carry home. But then one man stepped forward, not to claim her, but to give her a bed. What does it take to change a life? Is it a kind word, a place to rest, or just someone who sees past the dirt and the silence? Now I ask you this: what if the only thing standing between ruin and redemption was one stranger who refused to walk away? This is not a tale of heroes with guns. It's a story of quiet mercy, and the kind of love that doesn't ask questions, only offers a door left open. If stories like this stay with you long after the screen fades, subscribe to Wild West Echoes and share your thoughts in the comments. Because the world still needs reminders that love doesn't have to be loud to save someone. Now settle in. Let's begin Clara Mae's story. She couldn't even stand. Blood still trailed down her legs. And yet, they auctioned her like livestock, her and the newborn she barely had the strength to hold. The square in Deadwater Crossing shimmered under the hard sun of late August. Dust kicked up with every bootstep, swirling like smoke around the feet of ranchers, miners, and men with nothing but coin and cruelty in their pockets. The old courthouse steps had been turned into a platform wood splintered and darkened by sweat, spit, and worse. It wasn't the first time flesh had been sold there, but it might have been the first time it bled openly. Clara Mae Sims was dragged up by the elbow, barefoot, wearing what had once been a linen dress and was now barely a rag. Her skin was gray with exhaustion, lips cracked from thirst. A red stain ran from her hemline down her thighs, dried in streaks and pooled around her ankles. One arm cradled the baby tight to her chest. The other was shackled by a thick iron cuff, bolted to the railing behind her. The baby didn't cry. It whimpered in soft, shuddering gasps. Too new, too weak. The men laughed. "Still got blood on her," one said, spitting near her feet. "Like buying straight from the chute." Another added, "2 for 1. Woman and pup," the auctioneer barked, waving his arms. "Barely out the womb. You name it. You own it." Clara didn't look up. Her chin rested on her baby's head, shielding it from the jeers and the sun. She had no tears left, no voice either. Just the rhythm of breath, the dull throb of pain, and the knowledge that nobody, not one soul, had asked her name. The bidding began low. $50. Voices rose. 70, 95, 120. Each number stabbed deeper, not because she hoped for less, but because she hoped for nothing. Her body had already been taken. Her dignity was a memory. All that remained was the tiny warmth against her chest, and the last whisper of instinct telling her, "Protect this child." When the call hit 200, the auctioneer grinned. "Might just hit a record today," he said. "Must be the freshness." Then a voice came from the edge of the crowd, low, gravel-touched, calm like a storm that hadn't broken yet. 300. Silence fell like a dropped stone. All eyes turned. He stood alone, tall, broad-shouldered, sun-worn. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed most of his face, but what was visible was carved from time and dust. His coat was long and faded, boots scuffed but steady. He looked like a man who'd buried things, memories, maybe people, and walked away without turning back. The auctioneer blinked, uncertain. "Sir." "I reckon you meant I said 300, the man repeated. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "You planning to breed her or bury her?" someone called out. The man didn't flinch. He stepped forward, and every footfall on the board sounded like a warning. "I don't want her for labor," he said, "or for bed. I want to give her one." just a bed, just to sleep. Laughter bubbled up, unsure, then died. He rested his hand near the revolver at his hip, not drawing, just resting. "Anyone want to top it?" he asked the silence. No one did. The auctioneer swallowed, hammered the gavel. "Sold. To Mr. Boone," the man said. "Elias Boone." He stepped onto the platform, pulled a short, dull-bladed knife from his belt, and knelt. Without a word, he sawed through the iron chain around Clara's ankle. It clanged onto the wood with finality. She didn't speak. Her eyes, bloodshot and dry, met his just once. He extended a hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she pushed herself up with shaking limbs, baby still cradled, and followed him. Not because she trusted him, not because she believed him, but because he was the first one who hadn't looked at her like something to be used or discarded. The wagon was waiting, pulled by a single mule. There was no canopy, just burlap sacks and folded quilts in the back. He helped her up without touching her. The wheels turned, creaking over dry earth. Behind them, Deadwater Crossing faded into dust and heat, and the chain she left behind lay rusting on the sun-bleached boards, still warm. No one asked what to call her. Not the sheriff, not the auctioneer, not even the man who bought her. The wagon creaked beneath her as it pulled away from town, the wheels groaning over rock and root. The mule moved steady, unhurried. The man driving said nothing, just kept his eyes on the road, hands loose on the reins. Clara Mae sat in the back, pressed against a folded feed sack, her baby held tight to her chest. The world passed by in blurs of dry brush and brittle grass. The wind hit her skin like sandpaper, tugging at the sweat-damp curls that clung to her neck. She tried to keep count of the trees, tried not to close her eyes, but the heat had settled deep in her bones, and the fever came in soft waves. Her hands trembled as she rocked the baby. Her vision doubled, then swam. Somewhere between the miles, her head dropped, just for a moment, against the sideboard. The next thing she remembered was the squeal of the brakes and the sudden stop. A hand on the side rail, a shadow falling over her face. It was him. He didn't speak, didn't offer to carry her, didn't reach for the child. He simply stepped aside and gestured toward a narrow path that curved behind a weathered barn. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. She caught herself just before hitting the dirt. He didn't rush to help, only waited, silent, letting her find her footing on her own. Her breaths came shallow as she followed him. Behind the corral, half hidden by cedar trees and wild rose, stood a small wooden cabin. The door was slightly ajar. A faint glow flickered inside, low and golden. The man stepped aside and pushed the door open wider, then turned and walked away. Clara hesitated. The air inside smelled of smoke and iron and something she couldn't quite name clean. Maybe, or real. She stepped in. There was a cot in the corner. Not much, but it had clean sheets. A wool blanket folded neat at the edge. Next to it, a cradle carved from old pine. A tiny stove near the wall, embers still warm inside. And on the table bread, still steaming, and a chipped tin cup with water. She stared at it like it was a trap. She didn't sit, didn't eat, just stood with her back to the door, holding Maggie close. The baby stirred. She looked down and rocked gently. Her body throbbed, every part of her aching, but she didn't dare relax. Not yet. Then she saw it on the table. A folded piece of paper held down by a smooth river stone. Her name wasn't on it. Of course not. She picked it up. Sleep. Then we'll talk like people. That was all it said. Her hands trembled. No demands, no instructions, no threats, just a place to rest. She stayed standing a long while, the silence of the cabin wrapped around her like a blanket too soft to trust. She paced once, checked the window, tried the lock, then again, and again, finally. When the baby whimpered, she laid her down in the cradle, gingerly, like setting down something holy. The child did not cry. Clara sat on the edge of the cot, eyes darting to every corner. Then, slowly, with deliberate care, she reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small knife. The blade was dull, no longer than a finger, but it was hers. She slid it under the thin pillow, just in case. Then, for the first time in what felt like years, Clara Mae Sims lay back on a bed, not a floor. Not a barn stall, not a patch of dirt behind a saloon. A bed. She didn't sleep right away. Her eyes stayed open for a long time, watching the flicker of the stove light dance across the ceiling. Listening, waiting. But no boots stomped across the porch, no keys turned in locks, no breath but her own, and the tiny rhythm beside her. Eventually, her body surrendered. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Her eyes closed, just a sliver, her fingers relaxed, and the knife, though still there, stayed untouched beneath the pillow, in the quiet hum of the mountains, with the wind rustling cedar leaves outside. Clara slept, not deeply, not safely, but for the first time since Maggie was born, without fear. She whispered a name only in the dark, Maggie, because saying it aloud made it too real, too dangerous. The name came to her one night, somewhere between sleep and the quiet stirrings of dawn. The baby had stirred, fussed softly, rooting against Clara's skin with a whimper too weak to be called a cry. And in that moment, half asleep, half lost, Clara had breathed it out like a prayer. Maggie. She never said it when the sun was up, never when someone else might hear. Somehow, giving the child a name meant she might truly belong to her. And belonging in Clara's world had always been temporary. Still, she fed the baby with trembling hands, wrapping her in a scrap of flannel worn thin at the corners. She washed her face each morning with warm water from the kettle Elias had left by the door. Maggie's fingers curled around Clara's thumb, tiny and strong, and sometimes, when Clara thought no one could hear, she hummed an old tune from childhood. Elias never came inside the cabin. Each morning, just after first light, a new bowl of oats would appear on the doorstep, sometimes with a cup of goat's milk, still warm. Once there was a small wedge of peach tucked into a napkin. Another day, a sliver of smoked pork. Beside the food, always, a folded slip of paper, a word or two, simple things, water barrels full, more firewood stacked. Take your time. He never knocked, never waited to be thanked. At first, she didn't respond. She didn't know how. The idea of speaking back, even in writing, felt like opening a door she wasn't sure she could close. But one morning, after a night of fever dreams and Maggie crying for hours, she found herself scribbling a few words on the back of the paper before sliding it under the bowl. I'm not running. I'm just scared. The next day, the note she found simply said, "That's all right." Something cracked in her, quietly. She started leaving little notes more often, not long, never full sentences, just pieces of thought. He never asked questions, only replied with calm, steady words. The baby's fever broke. She's feeding better. I need more cloth. His replies were practical, gentle, human. Days blurred together like sun and dust on the hillsides. Clara swept the floor in slow motions, fixed a torn sleeve with careful fingers, and boiled water to bathe Maggie every other morning. She moved slowly, but with more purpose than she'd had in weeks, maybe months. Then, one afternoon, after laying the baby down for a nap, she noticed something she hadn't before. On the edge of the cradle, just beneath the folded blanket, was a square of white fabric, its edges worn, the thread faintly frayed. Tiny blue flowers were stitched around the border, delicate and uneven like a child's first attempt at embroidery. A handkerchief. She picked it up carefully. The stitches were old, the thread sun-faded, but someone had cared enough to make it beautiful once. There was no note, no explanation. Clara stood in silence, fingers brushing the cloth. It hadn't been there before, and it hadn't appeared by accident. He had left it, quietly, thoughtfully. Not for her to notice, but for her to have. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in so long. She wasn't sure if she remembered how. But something welled up, warm and sharp, in the middle of her chest. Not fear, not sorrow. Something gentler. That evening, when the food came, she waited. She waited until the heavy footsteps crunched across the porch again, until she heard the faint sound of a cup being set down. Then she opened the door. He had already turned to leave, but she stepped out barefoot, holding her baby in one arm and a folded piece of paper in the other. He stopped, turned. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Instead, she reached out tentative, almost trembling, and placed the note into his hand. Her fingers brushed his. Just for a second, rough skin met her own. Warm. Alive. He didn't flinch, didn't tighten his grip, just nodded once, gently, and stepped back from the porch. Inside the note were only 5 words. Thank you. For the cloth. "She's mine!" The man spat, got papers and all. Elias didn't argue. He just held up a board. Carved in big block letters were 5 words. Property doesn't breathe. She does. The man on horseback scoffed and waved the crumpled sheet in his hand. "State of Arizona says different." His voice cut across the dry afternoon air, slick and sour like spoiled wine. His name was Jed Coates, Clara's old overseer, or owner, depending on who you asked. And today, he'd ridden up the mountain with 2 other men and 3 guns. Clara watched from the window of the cabin, breath caught somewhere between ribs and throat. Maggie lay sleeping in the cradle behind her, unaware of the noise, the tension, the way the wind seemed to still between each exchange. Jed dismounted, dust clouding around his boots. "Boone," he said, tipping his hat without warmth. "You've been harboring property that ain't yours." Elias stood by the front gate, feet planted in the packed dirt. He didn't say a word. He just waited, steady. "I've got receipts," Jed continued, waving the paper again. "She was sold, signed and stamped, and she left without clearance. That makes her a fugitive, and you a thief." Still nothing from Elias. The second man behind Jed, a wiry type with a scar across his cheek, unhooked the flap of his holster. The third spat in the dirt and laughed low. Elias raised the board higher. "Property doesn't breathe." "She does." Jed's lip curled. "You trying to get poetic with me? Boone, you really willing to kill over a used-up girl and a screaming brat behind the cabin wall?" Clara's hands balled into fists. Her legs shook, but she didn't move. Couldn't. Every sound outside felt like thunder inside her chest. Elias finally moved. He walked 3 paces forward slow, deliberate, and stood at the split fence line. One hand rested on the post, the other near the rifle slung over his back. "You don't speak much," Jed said, sniffing. "But I'm going to tell you plain. Either hand her over now, or I come back with the sheriff. Or maybe without him. That girl's got a price tag, and I aim to get paid." Elias didn't blink, didn't nod, didn't move. Instead, He turned, stepped to the porch, and picked up his rifle from the rail. Then, as calm as someone shooing off a fly, he aimed toward the dirt just inches from Jed's boots and fired. The shot echoed through the canyon like a crack in bone. Jed jumped back, cursing, hand going to his holster, but Elias already had the rifle lowered, not threatening, just present, watching. A thin line of smoke curled from the muzzle. "Goddamn fool," Jed hissed. He looked to the other men. "We'll be back, with law if we have to, with fire if we don't." He spat near Elias's boots, then turned, mounted. The 3 horses kicked up a storm of dust as they rode off, fast and angry. It took a long moment for the silence to settle again. Not quiet, silence, thick and pulsing. Inside the cabin, Clara slid down to the floor. Her breath came back in short, sharp gasps. Maggie stirred. She reached for her daughter with shaking hands. A few minutes later, there was a knock. Soft. 2 taps. Then Elias stepped in for the first time since she arrived. He didn't carry the rifle. He held out a scrap of wood, same one he'd used, and placed it gently on the edge of the table. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a pencil. He wrote something slow and deliberate, then turned it toward her. "You okay?" Clara nodded. Her voice barely worked, but she whispered, "You could have died." Elias took the pencil again. He wrote 3 words. "So could you." Her body gave out by the stove. Fever took hold, and Elias caught her before the floor did. It happened on a Tuesday. The morning had started quiet, clear sky, soft breeze, the smell of wood smoke curling from the chimney. Clara had been boiling water for Maggie's bath, moving slow but steady. Her cheeks were already flushed, her breath too fast, but she kept going, stirring the kettle, folding cloth, rocking the baby with 1 foot as she worked, until she didn't. Her knees buckled without warning. The pot clattered to the side. Hot water splashed across the hearth, and Clara went down with it. Elias had been crossing the yard, a sack of flour slung over his shoulder. He heard the crash and dropped everything. By the time he reached the cabin, she was crumpled by the stove, her dress soaked, skin burning to the touch. He didn't ask question. He didn't wait. He lifted her carefully, 1 arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back, and laid her down on the cot. Then he checked the baby, who had started to cry in confusion, not fear. Elias moved with a quiet urgency. He filled a bowl with cool water and dipped a cloth, pressed it gently to Clara's forehead, changed it when it grew warm, replaced it again. Hours passed. Then the night. He didn't sleep. When Maggie fussed, he rocked her in the cradle, whispering something low and even. When Clara moaned, he sat closer, wiping sweat from her neck, her chest, her arms. She drifted in and out of consciousness, voice broken by fever. They laughed. She murmured once, said I was still bleeding. Elias said nothing. He only reached for the cloth again. They put a price on me. She mumbled later. Didn't ask if I had a name. Another time, she called out soft and wild, "Mama, no, please, not the cellar." Elias gripped her hand, held it until the shaking eased. By the second night, he looked as worn as she did. His eyes were red, his hands cracked from washing, from wringing out cloth. He moved slower, but he didn't stop. Not once. By the 3rd night, the fever began to break. Her breath evened out. The shaking eased, her skin turned from burning to merely warm, and finally, her eyes opened just barely. The cabin was dim. The fire had gone low. A breeze rustled the chimes outside, soft as a lullaby. She blinked. It took a moment to understand what she was seeing. Elias curled on the wooden floor beside the cot, 1 arm cradling Maggie against his chest. the other resting across his lap. The baby had fallen asleep against him, her little fist curled near his collarbone. His boots were off, his coat draped over the two of them like a blanket. He was snoring, just a little. Clara stared. Her throat hurt, her body still ached. But something in her heart quieted, not because she was safe, but because for once she wasn't alone. She shifted, barely. The cot creaked. Elias stirred. He blinked, looked up, then down at the baby. He sat up slowly, adjusting Maggie so she wouldn't wake. Then he looked at Clara. Their eyes met for a long, quiet moment, and she asked, hoarse and small, "Why didn't you leave me?" He didn't reach for the pencil, didn't write a reply. He just smiled, soft and tired, a smile that said everything. I was sold for a price. This time, I choose. The fever passed, but Clara didn't rush. She moved through her days like someone learning the weight of their own body again, slowly, carefully, as if every step needed to be earned. Each morning, she wrapped Maggie close against her chest and stepped outside. The air was cool, pine-scented. A breeze stirred the tips of the cedars. Far off, coyotes yipped at the tail end of dawn. She began tending the small patch of earth behind the cabin, turning soil with a rusted spade, planting seeds Elias had left in a burlap sack by the door. Carrots, peas, wild onion. Her hands blistered easily, but she kept working. Elias didn't hover. He fixed fence posts along the ridge, mended the henhouse roof, cut wood in even stacks. Sometimes he passed her a hammer or a coil of wire, and they worked side by side without speaking. They didn't need to. Maggie was growing, her neck stronger, her eyes more curious. She tried to sit up, then learned to grab the hem of Clara's dress with sticky fists. Clara laughed once, quiet and startled by the sound. It had been so long since her own voice didn't sound like something broken. In the evenings, Elias sometimes left a tin cup of sweet tea on the porch rail. Not too sweet, just right. A kindness with no strings. Then, one afternoon, as the sun sank low behind the hills, he stepped onto the porch holding a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table beside her. Inside, in neat lettering, was a single sentence. If you ever wanted it, my name's yours. Clara looked down at the paper for a long time, then she folded it, set it aside, and said quietly, I don't need your name. She watched his eyes shift just slightly. I don't need it, she said again. But I'm not going anywhere either. He nodded once, not hurt, not surprised, just understanding. There was no silence between them, only space, shared. That night, after Maggie fell asleep in the cradle, Clara lit a single candle and sat at the small table by the window. She pulled out the old handkerchief he'd once left, now washed, folded, and resting near her sewing tin. Then she did something she hadn't done since before she was sold. She wrote her name. Full. True. The one no one had asked for. Clara Mae Sims. She said it aloud once, just to hear it again. The sound filled the cabin gently. No longer dangerous. No longer a secret. In the morning, she took a small carving knife and walked out to the cabin's front door. There, in the soft pine wood just above the handle, she began to carve. Slow, careful strokes, letters shallow but deliberate. When she stepped back, sweat on her brow and dirt under her nails, the message read, This place is mine because I said so. She didn't tell Elias. She didn't need to. Later that afternoon, he passed by, carrying a coil of rope. He stopped, read the words, then tipped his hat, just a little, before walking on. One came barefoot, one came with a Bible. All came broken. They didn't arrive all at once. They came in whispers, in footsteps, soft as wind. No announcements, no letters, just bruises, silence, and the kind of fear that lived in the corners of the eyes. The first was a girl no older than 17. Her lip was split. She carried nothing but a threadbare shawl and a quiet that weighed more than her body. Clara didn't ask where she came from, didn't ask who had hurt her. She only opened the door, led her to the cot, and said, "Sleep." The girl slept for 16 hours. When she woke, Clara gave her warm bread and a needle and thread. They mended a torn apron together in silence. A week later, another came. This one was older, maybe 25, with a child on her hip and fear in every step. She wouldn't let anyone near her baby, not even Clara. She kept a Bible pressed tight to her chest, but never opened it. She cried only once when Elias fixed the porch step and left without a word. Clara gave her space and time. That was all they ever needed. The little cabin became more than just shelter. It became a place where names were spoken gently, where silence wasn't punished, where no one was asked to explain their bruises. Clara began teaching them simple things: how to boil rice without burning it, how to sew a hem that wouldn't unravel, how to hold a child without trembling. She didn't teach survival. They already knew that. She taught remembering. Each woman who came was given the same question, only when they were ready. What do you want to be called? Some chose names they'd never dared use. Some reclaimed the ones taken from them. One simply said, anything but what he called me. Clara stitched their chosen names into linen tags and placed them in a small wooden box beside the hearth, a box of beginnings. One night, after the children had been fed and the lamps turned low, Clara sat beside a girl who hadn't spoken in days. Her hands were raw from scrubbing laundry, her shoulders hunched even when she wasn't carrying anything. The girl whispered, so soft Clara almost didn't hear "I slept last night." Clara turned. The girl's eyes were wide. Honest. "I slept," she said again, not all the way, but without fear. Clara nodded once, her throat too tight to speak. That night, Clara stayed up late by the window, writing by candlelight in the small leather journal Elias had given her the winter before. She wrote slowly, the pen scratching soft across the page. "We don't save them," she wrote. "We help them remember who they are. No words, just a baby, swaddled in torn cotton, crying beside a tobacco slip with one name, Lila." It happened on a morning like any other, the kind where the wind was too soft to feel, and the sky hadn't yet decided whether to stay blue or gray. Clara rose early, as she always did. Maggie, now toddling, was still wrapped in sleep, her tiny snores mixed with the creak of wood and the faint rustle of chickens out back. Clara stepped outside, cup of warm coffee in hand, eyes squinting toward the barn. That's when she saw it. A bundle, not large, not moving much. She didn't run, not right away. Something in her body recognized what her mind couldn't yet name. Her breath caught. The mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the porch with a sound sharp enough to wake the dead. Then she moved, fast, bare feet hitting the ground, nightdress billowing behind her like a broken flag. The bundle was laid beside the barn door, on top of a folded flour sack. A baby, no more than a day old, skin still pink and tender, mouth searching, crying soft like a breath caught in a dream. The torn cotton swaddle barely held together. Her hair was damp, her lips cracked, and tucked beneath her was a crumpled slip of tobacco wrapping, worn thin at the edges. One word scratched in charcoal, Lila. That was it. No last name. No explanation. Clara dropped to her knees, hands trembling as she reached forward. The weight of the child settled into her arms like something she'd lost long ago and had only now remembered how to hold. She rocked gently, back and forth, back and forth. Then the sob came, not loud, not violent, just deep, from the part of her chest that had stayed locked since the day she first bled on auction wood. Elias found her like that, kneeling in the dirt, arms wrapped around a crying child, her hair clinging to her face with tears and morning sweat. He didn't speak, didn't ask, just came down beside her, resting one hand on her back, the other on the baby's head. "She smells like river clay," Clara whispered. "I think she was born yesterday, maybe last night." She looked up at him, her face streaked with earth and salt, eyes red but steady. "Who leaves a baby like this?" she asked. "What kind of world lets that happen?" Elias's voice was low, the kind that forgets what kindness is. They sat in silence after that. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint smell of oats and smoke from the stove still burning in the cabin. The porch creaked behind them, and somewhere inside, Maggie stirred and called out softly for her mama. Clara held the baby closer. The cries had softened now more like sighs than screams, the kind of sound a newborn makes when they're not sure if they're safe yet. "I know that sound," Clara murmured. She looked back down at the tiny girl. "No more cold floors," she whispered. "No more doorsteps." She stood slowly, her body stiff, knees sore from the ground. Elias stood beside her, but didn't reach for the baby. He didn't need to. Clara walked toward the cabin with Lila cradled against her chest, heart steady beneath the weight of a promise. As she stepped onto the porch, she turned to Elias, voice firm despite the quiver in her jaw. "She sleeps inside. She's not dirt." Elias nodded once, the faintest smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. The door closed behind them, and for the second time in Clara's life, the warmth of a fire met the breath of a newborn. This time, it wasn't her own child, but the love was just as fierce. "I don't have a ring," Elias said, "but I have a name." It was late. The kind of late where the lamp oil runs low and the wind outside brushes against the windows like it's checking to see if you're still awake. The kitchen smelled of cornbread and wood smoke. Maggie and Lila had both fallen asleep, one in the cradle, the other swaddled tight in a basket by the fire. Clara stood at the sink, sleeves rolled, hands damp from washing up. Elias leaned against the doorway, hat in his hands, boots off, posture soft in the way it only got when he forgot to carry the weight of the world on his back. She hadn't heard him speak much that evening. He'd helped clean the stalls, repaired a loose board in the chicken coop, even whittled a new rattle for Maggie out of cedar wood. But now he stood still, quiet, watching her like he'd been working up the courage to speak for a long time. Clara turned, drying her hands on a worn towel. That's when he said it. "I don't have a ring," Elias began again. "Not much land either, not compared to most, but I've got a name." She blinked. The room felt suddenly too still. He stepped forward slowly, placing the hat gently on the table like he didn't want to disturb the moment more than he already had. "If you ever want it," he said, voice quiet but firm, "it's yours." Clara didn't answer at first. She looked at the two sleeping children, their soft breaths, the way their fingers curled into tiny fists, as if dreaming of holding on. Then she walked to him, one step, then another. She placed a hand on his chest, right over the spot where his heart beat slow and steady. Warm, alive, real. "I don't need a ring," she whispered. He didn't flinch. I don't need land or promises made under roofs that leak. Her voice caught just slightly. But a name given, not taken, that's worth something. He looked down at her, eyes steady but damp around the edges. I was sold once, she said, voice barely above a breath. This time, I choose. She leaned into him, not like falling, more like arriving. His arms circled her waist, pulling her close, not tight, just enough for her to know he'd hold on if she let him. So is that a yes, he asked, breath brushing against her temple. Clara nodded. I'll take your name, she said, but not just to live, to build something. The fire cracked softly behind them. Outside, the wind had settled. Inside, everything felt still, except for the soft thud of two hearts choosing the same rhythm. Later that night, after the last dish had been dried and the lanterns turned low, Clara tucked both girls in. She kissed the crowns of their heads, one by one, then stepped back to watch them sleep. Maggie mumbled in her dreams. Lila stirred but didn't wake. Clara turned to Elias. His hand found hers. No vows were spoken, no papers signed. But in that room, with warmth on the walls and breath in the cradle, home finally meant something. Not just shelter, not just safety, but belonging, chosen, shared. And for the first time in either of their lives, it was enough. The scar around her ankle never faded, but now it no longer defined her. It was just skin pale and smooth where the iron had once bit deep. Maggie found it one autumn afternoon. She was 5 now, full of questions and curiosity, her tiny hands always reaching for stories the world hadn't yet told her. They sat on the front porch. The leaves turned gold and dry around them, rustling like secrets in the wind. Clara had her feet up on the rail, dress hitched slightly above her ankles. Maggie sat curled in her lap, tracing the old mark with soft fingers. "What's this, Mama?" she asked. Clara didn't flinch. She looked down at her daughter's hand, warm, unafraid, real. "That," she said, voice calm, "was a lock." Maggie's brows knit. "Why would someone lock you?" Clara exhaled slowly. "Because once, someone forgot I was a person." Maggie's eyes widened. "That was silly." Clara smiled then, not sad, just quiet. Yes, it was inside the house. Lila giggled from the kitchen as Elias helped her mix cornmeal for supper. The sound echoed out through the open door, warm and whole. Peace didn't mean silence here. It meant no one watching the windows, no one flinching at footsteps. It meant sleep without fear. That afternoon, a new girl came. 17, maybe. Barefoot, lips cracked, hair tangled, dress clinging like a second skin. She didn't knock, just stood at the fence, like she wasn't sure if she'd made it far enough. Clara rose from the porch and walked out to meet her. They didn't speak at first, just looked at each other. The girl's eyes darted past Clara's shoulder toward the porch, the laughter, the smell of stew on the wind. Then she whispered, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Clara didn't answer right away. She remembered saying the same thing once, in a cabin where kindness had felt like a trick. Then she reached out, not to touch, but to steady the space between them. "Stay," Clara said softly, "until you know." The girl nodded once, then followed her through the gate. That night, after the children were fed and the kitchen quieted, Clara opened her journal. It was old now, leather-worn, corners curled, pages faded with use. She wrote slowly, carefully, like each word was a truth she had earned. "I was once auctioned right after birth, still bleeding, but I was loved like a person. That's the only price that ever mattered." She closed the book and set it gently on the shelf, behind her. Elias tucked the girls in, their small breaths rising and falling beneath patchwork quilts. Outside, the wind stirred the chimes on the porch, soft, steady, familiar. Clara stepped out for a moment. The stars overhead blinked like old friends. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote called, but it sounded more like a song tonight than a warning. She looked at the cabin, the fence lines, the small bunkhouse built from nothing but pine and stubborn hope. She thought of the girls who'd come, and the ones still on the road. This place wouldn't change the world, but it was a place where no one slept with fear. And for Clara Mae Sims Boone, that was enough. Sometimes the greatest acts of love aren't loud. They don't come wrapped in grand gestures or heroic declarations. They come quietly in the form of a warm bed, a soft blanket, or a name spoken with respect. Clara Mae's story reminds us that no one is beyond redemption, and no soul should ever be seen as less than human. She was broken, discarded, and forgotten, but one man chose to see her, not for what she had been through, but for who she could still become. Many of us have carried scars, some visible, others hidden deep. But healing doesn't require fixing the past. Sometimes all it takes is being given the space to breathe, to rest, and to choose our own path forward. Kindness is never wasted. A gentle hand, a steady voice, a quiet room, these can save lives in ways the world may never notice. But the person receiving them, they never forget. So if you're ever in doubt about what difference you can make, remember Clara Mae. Because sometimes all someone needs to start again is to be seen and to be given a place where no one sleeps with fear. Thank you for staying with us through Clara Mae's journey. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes. Your support helps us keep these forgotten voices alive, one story at a time. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that healing is possible, share this with them. We'll be here with more stories of quiet courage and love that saves.